friends, and welcome to What the Fringe, the podcast dedicated to all things Fringe theater. I'm your host, Lauren Hance. Each week, I visit with a Fringe artist to hear all about their endeavors and gain insight into their process. This week, I'm visiting with Britt Lafield from SoHo Playhouse in the Fringe Encore Series. SoHo Playhouse has been one of Off Broadway's primary venues for new plays for the past 80 years. Formerly Van Dam Playhouse, the theater has been home to countless dreams and movements. Many actors, directors, choreographers, production designers, theater managers, technicians, and producers have all received their start at SoHo Playhouse. Several of America's leading writers have premiered their work at 15 Van Dam Street, including Sam Shepard, Edward Albee, Tracy Letts, Charles Buch, Leroi Jones, and Lanford Wilson. SoHo has featured multiple award-winning shows such as Boys in the Band, Crap 39, and the Broadway sensation Job and Fleabag. Other notable performers such as Trevor Noah, Daniel Sloss, Hannah Gadsby, and TJ and Dave have graced the stages of the SoHo Playhouse. The Playhouse has also proudly served as home to the Fringe Encore Series since 2005.
Our mission statement, we use the kind of jargony term of keeping the spirit of Off Broadway alive, and people might ask, what does that mean? It's the uniqueness. The best way to put it is actually a quote from Edward Albee, and it just rang, not only our historic bells from him starting here or doing the playwright lab here, but it's exactly what we do. And I might bastardize it a little bit, but he basically said, people go to Broadway to see a show. People come off Broadway to hear a show. And that's really the difference that we try to make. It doesn't mean that everything has to be super serious or have a point, but we want you to come to our theater and see something that you're going to go, well, I'm never going to see that anyplace else.
Britt Lafield has been working in the New York theater scene as an actor and producer for over 30 years. He has been associated with the SoHo Playhouse for over 20 years as the general manager, managing director, and producer, having even produced his own wedding on the stage in 2011. Devoted to creating new and exciting productions and helping younger theater artists, he has been involved in producing several of the city's most prestigious theater festivals, including the New York International Theater Festival, the Planet Connection Festivity, founding the Rave Theater Festival, and culminating in creating and producing the Fringe Encore Series at the SoHo Playhouse for the past 15 years. He is committed to finding and bringing new work and artists to the SoHo Playhouse to create the best work lab for exciting theater in New York City. Britt, welcome to What the Fringe.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I learned about the SoHo Playhouse from some of my fellow Fringers who have performed there. And then I learned about the Fringe Encore series. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to get these people on the podcast. And thankfully, when I reached out, you were like, sure, I'll be on the podcast.
What better way to sit around for an afternoon than to talk about Fringe theater?
I know, some of our favorite things. Well, first, let's start talking about your journey as an artist. When did you realize that theater was your calling?
Oh, that happened very young for me. I grew up in Houston, Texas, a suburb of Houston, Texas, and my mom was involved in community theater. And there was one time when she was just starting out. It was one of her first plays that she ever did. My father couldn't babysit me at home for some reason. So she had to bring me to her rehearsal that day. And she brought a bunch of toys with me, and we were in this big auditorium, and she was just like surrounding me with my toys in the back and said, look, just be quiet and just sit back here and play. But as soon as they started rehearsing, I forgot all about my toys. I was just transfixed by what they were doing on stage. And here I was at, 7 years old, and I was like, oh, I want to do that. Whatever that is they're doing, that's what I want to do. So that started my love of theater right there.
That's so great. Had you seen your mom in a show before that, or was that kind of your first introduction?
That was my first introduction, but she scarred me a lot going as I grew up because they would do all these like heavy dramas. One of the first ones she ever did, I had to have been like 8 years old, was Bad Seed. You know that show? She played the mom, and what happens at the end of the show is the mom kills herself. She takes a gun and goes upstairs, and you hear a gunshot. And I freaked out in the audience. I thought my mom was gone. And everybody knew who I was who worked there. And we're like, no, your mom's fine. Your mom's fine. She's just backstage. Come on, we'll go backstage. We'll see her. But I was beside myself because I thought something had happened to my mother.
Poor baby Britt. Oh my goodness. Like, you were so invested. You're like, theater's my thing. And like, this is all real. And now I don't have a mom.
Now I'm an orphan.
Yeah, I know. I'm an orphan. So How did you end up as a producer?
I came to New York to go to college. I went to NYU. And then kind of the first time I produced was really a fluke. I had taken like an elective on how to produce a show. Just as I was curious, I wanted to find out more about it. I was also a business major at the time, so I was kind of doing both sides at the behest of my father. So I took this elective on how to do that. And at the time, there used to be a program at NYU where the NYU system is broken up into acting studios. And if you went to a certain studio, you had to go for 2 years. And if you went for a third year, at the time, they would, at the end of the year, produce a showcase for you to have industry and other actors and managers come and check you out. So I had gotten into my third year of our program. I went to Circle in the Square. And I got to my third year, and we were about 2 months into my last year in studio. And all of a sudden, NYU went, hey, you know that whole showcase thing we used to do, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. And me and all my friends who had stayed in the studio basically for that purpose to get this showcase were really upset. So we actually went to the dean of Tisch School of the Arts at NYU and said, this isn't fair. You know, this is why we stayed. If we had known differently, we would have changed studios, maybe tried to learn a different acting style sort of thing. And NYU, to its credit, I guess, said, okay, well, we're still not going to do that showcase thing, but if you guys want to, we will rent a theater for you to do a show in. And to their credit, Circle and Square also stepped up and said, well, we'll pay for a director for your show. You have to figure out all the rest. So then, of course, me and my friends were all looking at each other like, okay, well, what are we going to do now? And I literally went, I just took an elective on how to produce a show. I can produce it. And that was my first production. We did The Rhymers of Eldridge by Lanford Wilson, and I produced it. And then once we got out of school, you did the same thing you always do when you're an actor and you get out and you audition. But there wasn't a lot of stuff coming down the pike. So me and my friends just started putting on our own shows. And that was I was usually acting in it, but also kind of doing the producing of it and kind of coordinating all that. Now that's at that level, you're not really doing what a producer does in Off Broadway or anything, or what I do now. But it definitely taught me about everything that I do now and how to do that sort of thing. And it really informed me so much more about where my journey ended up taking me. And we'll talk about it with Fringe and everything like that, because there was a lot more opportunity at that time in New York to do theaters in like basements in like the Lower East Side. They had all these funky little venues that you could rent out for, a couple $100 a week. And you'd put up shows. And yeah, it would pretty much just be your friends who came and saw you. You maybe try to get a listing in like the Village Voice in your free listings to try to get somebody. But you, of course, would freak out if there was somebody there that nobody knew. You'd be like, oh my God, where are you from?
How'd you hear about that show? Oh my gosh. Everybody's shaking their hands.
Hi, how are you? Very waiting for Guffman, although they were never Guffman. So, but that was kind of where I cut my teeth and where I really first started learning producing and learning that end of the business, and eventually got a job. My first kind of producing job that wasn't a show that I was just doing producing on my own. I actually worked for the New York International Fringe Festival. I was their festival administrator from 2009 to 2013. And actually before that, though, was when I started the Fringe Encore Series. That was very much grew out of the New York Fringe Festival. As I said, I was, doing theater on my own in the Lower East Side. And then, in the late 90s, there was all of a sudden this festival in New York City that was all these small, funky venues doing small, funky shows, which is exactly what me and my friends were doing anyway. And so I was really enamored with it and very much found my people, almost to say. My very first off-Broadway producing credit was a show from the New York Fringe Festival called Never Swim Alone by a Canadian playwright named Daniel MacGyver. My friend happened to be in the show, invited me to come see it, and it was right up my alley. It was stylized, it was cool, it was very impactful, and it ran like an hour. So decided to take it. I had worked with a producer as their assistant. In fact, our artistic director here at the SoHo Playhouse, Darren Lee Cole, used to be an independent producer himself, and I found him, and I began working for him as his assistant. This is where my association with this theater started, 20 plus years ago, 30 years ago now, 25. We did Tracy Letts' Killer Joe, the New York premiere of Tracy Letts. Amazing play. It was here at the SoHo Playhouse. It was a lot of very famous people's first off-Broadway shows. Sarah Paulson. It was Scott Glenn. It was Amanda Plummer, all doing their first shows here in New York. And I was company managing that show. So that's how I found out about the theater. And then when it came time to do Never Swim Alone, I thought of this theater. So I reached out to the gentleman who was running it at the time, who was a kind of rich guy who almost had it as like a hobby. He had taken on the lease to produce a show called Grandma Sylvia's Funeral, which was one of the very first interactive shows in all of New York back in the 90s, when it was that and like Tony and Tina's Wedding. But this one was a grandma, like a Jewish grandmother's funeral. And you started off as an audience member outside, and the hearse drove up and they pulled the casket out, and it was a whole thing.
That's fun.
Yeah. So when I contacted him to do Never Swim Alone, I said, hey, I hope you remember me, but I'm looking to do this other show here. He was like, yeah, sure, you can rent it out, but I don't really have a staff. I was like, great, I'll be the staff. Let me be this, knock a few $100 off the rent, and I'll run the place for you. He said, great. So I did that show for about 3 months. It went out pretty well. Then I was like, okay, I'm out of here. And he was like, well, do you want to just stay around and run the place for me? And I was like, sure. So I did that for about 3 years, and we did a lot of other things. Killer Joe was also Michael Shannon's first role. I shouldn't leave that man out of the whole thing. So I ran the place for about 3 years, took a little break, and about that time, Darren Lee Cole, our artist director, who was a good friend of mine, actually took over the theater. I was working with him on a totally different production at that point, and so I came back here with him, and knowing the place as well as I did, helped him renovate the place, and pretty much since then, I've kind of come and gone and did little parts then, but then I came back as the managing director back in 2019, and I've been here ever since.
That is a journey.
Yeah, that is my journey, at least with the SoHo Playhouse. And then we'll probably talk about my journey just with Fringe Theater, because that's also its own tale itself. So, like I said, I was involved in just the New York Fringe and loved it, and my passion kind of grew out of seeing those shows and being a part of it. And I got to know all the people who ran it. Probably one of my favorite experiences ever was when I was a venue director for the New York Fringe. And you talk about like a theater boot camp, because you are the person who is there for every single show, every single day, from the time it opens to the time it closes. And I had a ball working with all these shows and being in charge of the venue and running all of that. Just loved it. But about that time, it was the 10-year anniversary at that point of the New York Fringe. And they had invited back like 10 of the most popular shows that had been a part of it in that 10 years. And the show Never Swim Alone was invited back. So because I had produced Off Broadway, the original producers invited me to come help produce that run. And me and one of my producing partners at the time, after like a production meeting of some sort, we're sitting at a bar, having a drink, and kind of lamenting the fact that it was difficult for so many of the people who were a part of the Fringe, because they were usually young theater companies, young artists, young professionals. And if they ended up like having a hit on their hands, like maybe they got a good review out of the New York Times or a word of mouth hit, and they started selling out their show, they would get done with their 5 performances as a part of the Fringe and be like, what do we do now? And not really have the answers. And we kept seeing great shows either just kind of disappear or get involved with the wrong kind of producers who would just mess it all up. And so we thought, you know what, there should be something that we could do about that. And the idea we came up with was the Fringe Encore Series, which was kind of like a best of the New York Fringe, because the New York Fringe was a big, big festival back in its original incarnation. We would usually do somewhere in between like 600 to 1,000 different shows over 2 weeks in like 20 different venues all over Lower Manhattan. So we would usually pick about 10% of the shows. And so we get up like maybe around 15 to 20 different shows. We would invite back, and basically that festival always took place in August, when a lot of like theater industry people wouldn't be around. So we put that in September and allowed people to, invite more industry in, get a little bit more exposure out of the show. And we would try to help them in any way that we could, if they wanted to know how to produce it off Broadway, or how to get a tour of it up, or how to get it published. You might not know everybody involved in how to do that, but we can at least point them in the right direction and set them off on that journey. And that's how the whole thing began. And I did that for at least a decade. And pretty early on, Darren Cole here got involved and helped me put it here at the Playhouse and helped me produce it for years and years and years. And actually, one year, he was producing a show at Edinburgh, the kind of grandfather of all Fringes, and had the idea of, hey, how about we start incorporating like some Edinburgh shows into the Encore series? I said, that's a great idea. And then back in, I think it was 2018, unfortunately, the New York Fringe, as in that incarnation, ended up closing its doors and went under. So at that point, we shifted and we turned it into an international Fringe Encore series. So he and I literally spent about half our year going around to all the major Fringe festivals all over the world and kind of see as much as we can and pick the best shows that we love out of all those festivals and invite them here for runs here in New York, usually at the beginning of the year, every year. So through that, and from the incarnation of it just being New York Fringe festivals to now, we've probably produced over 500 shows, I think, out of that festival alone and how we present things. So yeah, it's definitely part of my producing DNA just to be a part of that.
That is such a gift to the Fringe community and just young artists. I was hearing you talk about that, and I just hear so much passion in your voice for being a cheerleader, if you will, for artists and helping them kind of navigate stuff that they may not know. And Fringe artists, some of the shows I've been following here that were just nominated this year, I've seen them around for a couple of years, and I think sometimes we go, well, what's next? And so it's really unique that you provide another stepping stone for them to come to New York, maybe get seen by producers and maybe take that next step. That's really, really special.
I mean, the best work is being done, in my opinion, on Fringe stages. It's just, you can't get more inventive. You can't get more raw, and it's everything that just pushes my theatrical buttons. So
yeah, absolutely. Like I started doing Fringe the past couple of years, and it's my niche. Like everybody finds their little niche in theater. These are my people. This is my place, and I'll shout it from the rooftops. I believe that Fringe is the future. I know it's so cheesy to say that, but I think it is, because it is so innovative and creates that space for artists to be able to just do what it is they want to do, and then people didn't even realize they needed what they saw in their lives.
And I think it's also, I personally think it helps artists to kind of have the restrictions of what you have in a Fringe show. Has to be a certain amount of time. Has to be able to get on stage in probably 15 minutes and get off stage in 15 minutes. So it causes them to think differently. To have those kind of restrictions, to me, opens up creativity, because it's like, well, I can't have a full fountain on stage. So what can I make that I can bring on stage in 15 minutes, but will convey a fountain, because it's such an important part of my show. And that's what I love. I love saying what's the problem solving elements of your show that I love, and the subject matter, because usually I find that Fringe shows are what I call idea shows. Yes, they might have a plot or anything like that, but it's usually some kind of riff on an idea.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Lighthouse series. We haven't touched on that yet. I'll just read a little bit about it for folks so they can get familiar with it. It's a competition specifically designed to showcase the best talent and writers across the New York City area. And each night, the audience gets to see a group of shows, and then they vote for their favorites, which culminates into 6 finalists and a final showcase. And it happens every spring. So what led you all to create this series just for New York City-based playwrights versus kind of like Fringe or something like that?
It really came out of COVID. And doing that, I always have interns that work for me while I'm here. And I always, when I'm trying to teach them or let them see what I do as a producer, one of the things I try to do as often as possible is try to put them in my place. So I happen to have 2 brilliant young interns right after COVID, and sitting there one day with them, I said, okay, I'm looking at my calendar, and I have like in a month or a month and a half, I have 2 weeks. I don't have anything programmed. I don't know what we're going to do. So you're me. What would you do with 2 weeks of just bare stage time? And they were like, we have so many friends and we know so many people who just have scripts lying around, things that they wrote either before COVID or during COVID, and they've been able to do nothing about it. And so why don't we do like a new work series and try to get these people, a showcase to present these ideas and these scripts that they had. And that's absolutely what we are about here at the SoHo Playhouse, is developing new works. It's in the DNA of the building. When it became a theater again, the building itself is over 200 years old. It used to be a clubhouse for Tammany Hall, if you know what that is, which was kind of like a political party back in like the turn of the 20th century. They talk about it a lot in like the Gangs of New York, the movie Gangs of New York. But they used to have little clubhouses all over the city where they would, and this was Prohibition. So like this was one of their clubhouses. Our bar downstairs was a speakeasy at the time. Our stage was their meeting hall. And then when it came back as a theater in the early 60s, the very first occupant was Edward Albee, coming off of his success of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf on Broadway. He took basically all the money he made from that, and he turned around and he made a playwright lab here. So all of like the famous New York playwrights that came out in the late 60s and early 70s did all of the first works. I mean, you mentioned some of them at the top of the show, but Sam Shepard, A.R. Gurney, Lanford Wilson, all of these guys got their first shows were on our stage. And it's been that way. We've just constantly done that sort of work all around. And so this sort of thing really rung my bell, so to say. And it was an opportunity to get these people in it. And we had such success with the Fringe model, the Fringe Encore model of making it a competition. I wanted to also kind of offer it up to the young talent that's here. And the other unfortunate thing, especially in New York City, is all those opportunities that I had when I was young in my 20s and doing crazy theater, they've all kind of gone. There are no more Lower East Side theaters, basement theaters anymore. If there's anything like that, they have all kind of been pushed out to the boroughs. And Manhattan doesn't really have too many opportunities. And then for a while, it was summer play festivals or play festivals in general in New York. And they started drying up and going the way of the dodo. And so it just kind of like checked all my boxes. So it's exactly what you said. We actually just started this past weekend. We have 15 different shows. We give everybody about 25 to 30 minutes and that can be an entire show that's just a 30-minute show. It can be an excerpt from a show. It could be a monologue. It could be whatever they want it to be. We pick 15 different shows to do. And the first round is audience voting. So everybody gets a ballot on their way in. On the way out, they rank all 3 shows, 1, 2, 3. And whoever wins that group is then invited back. We'll do the next round this summer in July. So it gets down to kind of like 5 or 6 different groups. We give them a little bit more time then, so they expand their piece to about 45 minutes. And there's no voting in that round. That is more, we invite certain theater professionals, producers, theater craftsmen that we know and whose opinions we really respect. They come in and see all the shows, and as a group, we kind of pick a winner. And that winner is invited back once again to do a full off-Broadway run with us at some time, usually in the next calendar year. Didn't really know how that was going to go when we did it, and we unexpectedly caught lightning in a bottle our first year with the show Job by Max Friedrich. It was a brilliant piece that it started off as a full-length show, and he had cut it down to just a brilliant, 30 minutes of it. And the audience loved it, and we opened it up here, and it went like gangbusters. We sold out for 2 months. We unfortunately had to move on to other programming, but the show moved on to another off-Broadway space for another 2 or 3 months of sold-out shows, and then went all the way to Broadway and ran on Broadway for about 3 months. So it can't get really much more of a better success story than that. And from there, we've had 2 other winners since then. It's Not What It Looks Like, which is a brilliant piece by a young artist named John Collins, who is actually now in The Outsiders on Broadway. But it was a piece that he wrote. It was very different from Job in the fact that was such an artist-created piece, like a lot of Fringe shows are. So they weren't going to be in the same mold as Job. They weren't going to go out and get equity actors to perform in it. It worked because he developed that piece with his cohort in the show, and it worked because of them. So we gave them a run here, and that went really, really well, and we're super excited about last year's winner, a really great show called Unconditional by a young playwright named Allie Keller that we're going to be premiering here in the fall. It's going to have a full 6-week run with us in September and October coming up later on this year. And we're so excited about that one.
Y'all are like slinging out opportunities like a bartender at a bar, just like whoosh, catch it. Here's your martini. Here's your margarita.
Yeah, exactly. Here's your one act. Here's your full-length show.
Exactly. Here's your Broadway debut. You started here. That's beautiful.
So yeah, if you go to our website, our kind of tagline is, this is where legends get their start, and we try to own up to that as much as possible.
Well, let's talk about the Fringe Encore Series as well. I'll read a little bit about that. You can correct me if I get anything wrong, but it's the International Fringe Encore Series. It's an annual event that provides opportunities for emerging artists and exceptional talent to come to the SoHo Playhouse and have extended runs on Off Broadway, which we've kind of touched on that. So this series caters just to Fringe artists.
Yes, you have had to have been in a festival with your piece before. We stick with all the Fringe rules because we try to stack them up even when they're just by themselves as much as possible. So we'll usually have, at least 2 shows on a given night, at 7 o'clock and a 9 o'clock of 2 different shows. That's what we do normally, but especially during the Encore series. And like I said, we go from everywhere to Australia, to North America, down to Orlando, and out to Hollywood, and up to Canada. Canada has a fabulous Fringe circuit that they do every year.
Yes, so good.
Of course, Edinburgh and Brighton. We pulled shows from Prague and Italy. And like I mentioned earlier, it has taken much more of an international bend to it now, which we also find fascinating because, theater everywhere is interesting. But I think it's even more interesting to see what is interesting that's going on in Australia, what's interesting in Edinburgh, what's interesting in Hollywood. And it creates such an interesting lineup of shows every year that we were able to bring here that we just love.
How do you go about picking your shows other than, I feel like the number one quality is like, do a good show?
I mean, we try to be eclectic with what we pick. So I guess that's sort of another one, but really, no, it comes down to just being a good show, being unique and a good show, because we've had everything from very DIY sort of theater to pretty complex, both technically and thematically, shows that come through as a part of it. I mean, we've really been able to open up. And because of our work with the Encore series, it's also opened up to so many great artists from around the world who come and perform with us when we're not even doing Encore series. And we are able to still showcase their works outside of that festival as well. Yeah, it's kind of what we've been known for now for the past 10 years or so.
Yeah, and you had mentioned earlier that you run it like a competition, and as much as you can let out, because I know it can be very difficult for international artists to come into the U.S. So as much as you can share about that, the thought behind that and how that benefits those international artists to be able to perform off Broadway. I mean, what a huge credit for them to be able to do that.
Well, the one thing that is true is that they can't technically be paid. That is it. But because it is a competition, there's actually something within the visa system for the United States that says if an artist is coming in for a competition, they can basically come in on a tourist visa. They don't have to get a work visa. They don't have to get anything more complex than that. They can come in on a tourist visa and be able to perform. And it makes it so much easier for these artists to be able to gain access to not only the United States, but to New York itself, to be able to perform here. And hopefully gives them much more opportunity to be able to make more money down the road.
What a wonderful strategic way to create opportunity for people. And, I just hope as people listen to this that are interested in producing and will take that under consideration and being able to bring that talent in, because there's just such great stuff going on outside of the U.S. and we need to see it and support it. I want to ask you a couple questions here about like advice. So you are a producer, you see a lot of things. I'm sure people pitch to you all the time or figure out who you are and come talk to you. What kind of advice would you give to a fringer as they are trying to interact with an industry professional, maybe like best practices or things not to do?
Well, I will say they're both good and bad. I would always suggest, being persistent to a certain point. We do really respect and admire artists that are what we term pleasantly persistent. You're not overwhelming. You're not every day sending emails, but you check in a little bit. Let us know what you're doing, even though we are a small theater. So I do have a lot of responsibility just on my shoulders, just to make sure everything runs around here. So it's difficult for me to have constantly be in touch with artists, but just artists that are like, hey, I know we missed you on the last time, but we have this new show that we're doing and we're going to be in this festival this year, or we happen to be in town and if you'd like to come see us, or, just kind of keep us in the loop as far as getting in touch with us in particular. But I think in industry, people as a whole, I always say this about shows just as themselves before they even get to the professional part. It's like, know your audience. First of all, know what you are as an artist. Know what your pieces are about, what your type of theater is, because everybody's unique. And that is your best selling point, is be yourself and be the kind of artist. Don't try to make yourself into whatever you saw that was good last year. Your voice is what's going to be unique, and that's what's going to catch the attention of smart producers. And then know your audience. Not only is that going to help you when you're doing Fringe, to be able to go out there and find the groups that you believe your piece talks to, whether that's the subject matter or maybe it's an ethnicity sort of thing, but find your audience and then find the type of producers that do that kind of work. Because they're just like different artists, there are different producers that are very much in. Obviously, what we do here is very specific to kind of that Fringe model. But I think it goes even beyond that. Our mission statement, we use the kind of jargony term of keeping the spirit of Off Broadway alive. And people might ask, what does that mean? And it's the uniqueness. The best way to put it is actually a quote from Edward Albee. And it just rang, not only our historic bells from him starting here or doing the playwright lab here, but it's exactly what we do. And I might bastardize it a little bit, but he basically said, people go to Broadway to see a show. People come off Broadway to hear a show. And that's really the difference that we try to make. It doesn't mean that everything has to be super serious or have a point, but we want you to come to our theater and see something that you're going to go, well, I'm never going to see that anyplace else. I don't know where else I would go to see something like that. And yes, you might see something like it at a different off-Broadway theater, but it's that type of theater that we try to foster and we try to present to people, is something with a different bent, something with a different, way of looking at things, of telling a story, of, just being unique and expressing your voice as an artist.
I mean, this is why Fringe is the future in theaters, like Soho is the future. I mean, last night I was watching, I won't say the film, but it was like a remake of a film that was made a couple years ago. My kids were into it. And it's like, can't you think of something new? Like, can't you just go down to like off Broadway or to a Fringe show? Because there's a lot of artists out there who are doing really cool stuff that could turn into great Broadway shows, great films, great television. Obviously, we've started to see that happening more. But it's like, this is where it's at. And I think as our society continues to move towards, I keep saying this, I feel like I talk about it too much, but the AI, people are going to be longing for more in originality, and they're going to be coming and flocking to places like the SoHo Playhouse.
Well, I think that's kind of why they, this last, what some people say was this last golden era of television that we just had. I think that's why, because when streaming exploded and everybody was trying to find content, you did hear new voices. You did see interesting ways of telling stories. And that was some of the best programming that was coming out on that level. And that's, to me, what Fringe theater is. It's people doing voices. And we found some of the most talented artists that have gone on to do so many different things. Beyond that, I'm very proud of, during some of the earlier years of us doing Fringe Encore Series, I discovered the Pigpen Theater Company. And if you haven't checked them out before, they are a fabulous theater company that is very do-it-yourself theater. They do musical theater, but it's not like musicals. It's plays with music. I was fortunate enough to produce their first off-Broadway show called The Old Man and the Old Moon, which was a fabulous piece, storytelling at its finest. But those are the type of artists that, and now they just did the music for Water for Elephants on Broadway. They're constantly coming up with their own. They're doing regional theater all over the place because they found their voice, they knew their voice, and people understood how unique it was.
So encouraging. All right. Well, here we'll end with our last silly question that I love to ask people. What has been, and I feel like you have a lot of these, your most interesting or awkward Fringe interaction? You've done Fringe for many years, and I'm sure you could tell us a good story.
Oh man, yeah, you're right. There's almost too many to. It's like they crowd my head to think about. I will say this one is probably not the most unique, but it's one of my favorite stories because it really does speak to being a production in Fringe. So back when I mentioned before that I was a venue director for a year at the New York Fringe. And one of the hard and fast rules, if you're ever doing a Fringe show, is you come into a space and there's a rep light plot and that is what you get. And you don't get to do anything else. Maybe you get to plug in an extra instrument, maybe, but usually that's it. That's what you do. And the year I was a venue director, we had a show that came in. It had done a production before, and it all took place in a subway platform, a New York subway platform. And they had floor-to-ceiling flats. That was the background. That was an entire New York subway system. But when they fitted in the theater we were in, it cut off half the lights that they had access to. And they were like, can we please repatch some lights just so we're not half in dark and half in this? And I was like, guys, I shouldn't do it, but I'm going to let you do it. But the second something goes wrong, that's it. You don't get anything else. And sure enough, like after their second show, they went back and repatched everything wrong. And so the next show that came up, lights weren't working. Half the stage was dark. I was frantically calling over to Fringe Central, trying to get a TD over to our space, try to fix things like mid-run of the poor show that was afterwards. And I was like, that is it, guys. You know what? In fact, that's it. You can't perform your show anymore. Oh, here. Sorry. Can we please do our show again? And I was like, okay, sure. But you can't patch the lights anymore.
Well, Britt, it has been such a joy to visit with you today and to hear your passion for artists and Fringe and really progressing people's careers. Like, just thank you for what you do, and thank you for sharing with us today.
No problem. I do it basically because it's everything that I wanted when I was a young artist. I wish I had something like this, and was fortunate enough to kind of catch on to the New York Fringe when it opened. But yeah, I've always just tried to be the person that I wanted to try to find when I was a young artist. So
yeah, that's what we should all do. Well, the SoHo Playhouse is on 15 Van Dam Street, and the Lighthouse series happens every spring, and the International Fringe Encore Series happens every winter. You can learn more at sohoplayhouse.com and fringeencoreseries.com. Keep up with these events on Instagram at SoHo Playhouse NYC, and on Facebook at SoHo Playhouse and Fringe Encore Series, and on TikTok at SoHo Playhouse Theater. What the Fringe is produced and hosted by me, Lauren Hantz. This episode was edited by Ben Ellis of Renowned Media, and those sweet tunes you hear provided by Paul Snyder of Orchestra of Sound, and our logo was designed by Ruby Arnold of Ruby Makes Things. What the Fringe can be found on your favorite podcast platforms and now on YouTube. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know when new episodes release. Keep up with What the Fringe on Instagram at whatthefringe_productions, and find us online at whatthefringeproductions.com. There are some great folks out there that want to help you take your show to the next level, but be watchful. Listen, know when to run the other way, especially if they say something like,
I just took an elective on how to produce a show. I can produce it.